Welcome to a special 15-year anniversary episode of Stories from the NNI. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office, or NNCO. This morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Mark Tuominen, Associate Director for Research and Innovation and Professor of Physics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Mark is a Fellow of the American Physical Society as well as Director of NSF National Nanomanufacturing Network, an alliance of academic, government, and industry partners that cooperate to advance nanomanufacturing in the U.S. To get things started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe how you first got involved in nanotechnology?
Prior to graduate school, I was involved in manufacturing and as an undergrad, working at 3M and another company. And so I always had a hand in making things and loved making things. And then when I first was involved in nanotechnology was when I was a postdoc at Harvard in the early 1990s. And although it wasn't called nanotechnology at the time, it was rather mesoscopic physics. But at that time, I made and measured 100 nanometer scale electron tunneling devices known as single electron transistors. And these devices use their small size to control electrons one by one, or if they're made of superconductors, two by two. Derivatives of these superconducting devices are now used as qubits, otherwise known as quantum bits, for quantum computing research and development. And then when I transitioned to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where I am now, I began to work on ways of making devices even smaller, using the phenomenon of molecular self-assembly. And after trying a few things, I started a collaboration with polymer physicist Tom Russell, who had recently moved from IBM to UMass. And he was an expert in manipulating the assembly of so-called die block copolymers. Now, these polymers self-assemble into periodic patterns with features at the nanoscale. And I suggested that if we could remove just one of the blocks, leaving the other polymer in place, we would create structures that look like a honeycomb, except at the nanoscale, and we could use it as a nanoscale template to fabricate arrays of nanomagnets. And it worked. And that work led to other efforts combining chemical and lithographic nanomanufacturing processes, and eventually to our NSF Center, which was co-led by chemical engineer Jim Watkins and myself. So that's how it started for me.
So, there are a number of things that you discussed that I want to follow up on with respect to the impacts on quantum information, looking at the interdisciplinarity that you saw from the very beginning. But before we dive into some of those issues, as you know, the NNI is celebrating its 15-year anniversary. From your perspective, you mentioned a lot of advances just in your opening, but from your perspective, what are the most exciting research advancements that have been made in nanotechnology broadly that have been enabled by this initiative?
Oh, that's really a hard question to answer because there's so many different dimensions to it. And, right now I would say that in the evolution of the National Nanotechnology Initiative, there was a lot of exploratory work which was primarily fundamental science-based, but very quickly some of the excitement in these things that were being developed, like I mentioned, the ability to control electrons one at a time, the creation of things like quantum dots that through the architecture one is able to use quantum effects to control how material interacts with light, for example. There was really a need to move towards being able to make these at scale, at a manufacturing scale. So I want to emphasize the progress that's been made on scaling. Now, it's actually relatively straightforward to use the cutting edge research methods and tools to create a prototype, like one prototype or a couple, and to demonstrate something once. But it's a completely different thing to reproduce it reliably at the manufacturing scale. And there's been a lot of progress over the last years in what might call manufacturing research to scale up nanomanufacturing. And a couple of examples that I could mention are quantum dots, which were first developed in the 1990s, now can be mass produced and are used in products. And another one, which has just been an evolutionary progress in nanotechnology, is the size of semiconductor transistors, which are used in computer chips and other integrated circuits, and which are now being manufactured or beginning to be manufactured with 7 nanometer features, which was really practically unimaginable 15 years ago.
So I love your examples that range from quantum dots that, as you mentioned, are now mass produced in consumer electronics like displays. When you talk about the progress made on scaling, and you use the example of nanoelectronics, can you give a specific example of research that you've been engaged in where you've seen the transition from fundamental research into production in a more specific sense?
Well, let's see. There's a few different directions, I would say. And for example, when I mentioned electronics, that was a continuous evolution really from the 50s and 60s to the present. And so that's evolutionary development in which science has fed into it, making some of these advances possible. And that's sort of conventional, a huge industry-driven type of area. Another industry-driven area which has been around for a long time is the production of materials that have nanoscale features. So there's a bunch of companies that have for a long time been making particles by various methods down to the nanoscale. And what I think some of the huge improvements in when NNI work has made an impact in those existing industries where they already had a strong foothold in the area of nanotechnology was to add new functionality to make the processes more reliable at the nanoscale. And so that's sort of a fundamental area of technology which undergirds many things, many applications. And so, because this is basic material science, these materials go into things like composites, they go into electronics, they go into, different sort of applications. So there's a lot of examples like that have been going on. And I mentioned quantum dots before. That is really a new player on the scene, unlike the examples that I mentioned that are industries that have existed for a while based on technologies that have gotten better. The quantum dots, as I mentioned, those were really introduced through science in the 90s, and then all sorts of people started working on them, seeing their potential. And it took a lot of effort to introduce those. And a similar thing is now happening with graphene, and that's been very quick. Graphene was discovered or first paper was in 2004. And now it's at the point where companies are making large sheets of graphene for their electrical properties for use in displays and other areas because of their unique properties. So there's a lot of this back and forth between fundamental science and applications in manufacturing that has happened. And I think the NNI has really been a catalyst in that because it's brought people together in a synergistic way.
As you talk about the NNI having a role in bringing people together, and some people comment that the NNI kind of changed the way people reached across disciplines and worked together. Is that what you mean by synergistic activities?
I thank you for asking that question because, it's something that I personally experienced and benefited from, and many people benefited from getting together people from different disciplines. So, nanotechnology research and development as a whole has been very synergistic. People with different expertise and perspectives learning from each other, and out of this learning comes some collaborations which have been really strong. And I'd say it's truly an area of convergence. So when we established, for example, the National Nanomanufacturing Network, we intentionally brought diverse stakeholders together, from industry and academia and government, in a series of workshops focused on nanomanufacturing. And, the NNN started in, I think, 2006. And so, I had already experienced that interplay between different disciplines in some of the meetings that had been hosted by the National Science Foundation and other agencies. And I have to say that in the very beginning, it was difficult, like you say, that people are used to their disciplinary silos, they're used to their terminology, they're used to the concepts. And so there's a whole culture that grows up in an academic discipline. And listening to some of the work and ideas and directions from other disciplines, it is at first challenging because they use a different language, they use different terminology, but it's been worth that barrier of learning what these other folks do, because getting over that barrier has led to the synergy. And having worked in industry before, this concept or this practice of using interdisciplinary teams is standard, right? So when I worked at 3M, I was on a team with chemical engineers, chemists, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and others, all working towards some common purpose. And the same thing happens here. And I think it's less challenging for the folks from industry who are already used to that, but for the folks in academia who go deep within their specialty, it was more of a challenge. But this interdisciplinary science, I think it's really been catalytic for science as a whole, and then advancing nanotechnology far faster than I or most people imagined would happen.
With respect to the having a mission or goals, at the launch of the NNI, there were key challenges laid out as areas where nanotechnology would likely have an impact. From your perspective, looking into the future, 10 or 15 years or 20 years, where do you see exciting challenges that exist that you think nanotechnology will have a role in solving?
Well, just to set up my answer, because nanotech was new to everybody in the beginning, the things that people could think of using it for were to improve what they were already doing. In other words, to make computer chips better, to make materials stronger, things like that. But now that a lot of progress has been made in that area, and as people went on, the realization that there are altogether new applications unimagined before or thought not possible that might be possible in an Apollo type of way. And there are several of these. One I think that's really probably going to be underlying something that affects everyone is in the area of sustainability. In other words, we make a lot of stuff in the world, and we make things that are absolutely needed for our survival, and we make things that are helpful for our convenience. But when we make things, in the beginning, we'd really just try to figure out a way to make them that is reliable and reproducible. And sometimes those processes consume a lot of energy and a lot of materials. And so one of the things that I think nanotechnology will play a role in is the grand challenge of being able to manufacture more sustainable, more and more over time. And it's not always been a priority. I know it's an NNI priority. One of the key initiative areas is sustainable manufacturing, but it's really something that I think we need to work on more. I think the next generations of scientists and engineers that are coming along want to work on this because it's an investment in the future, their future. And I think it's one that we can prioritize.
Mark, I feel like I could continue this discussion for hours, but I want to be sensitive of your time, and thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today. Do you have any closing thoughts or final things that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think just to close, I really feel fortunate to be part of the growth of nanotechnology in the U.S. and to be part of the ecosystem. I just want to say what a privilege it's been to work with so many brilliant, inspired, and dedicated people. And it's a privilege to talk to you. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for joining us today for this story from the NNI. If you would like to learn more about nanotechnology, please visit www.nano.gov or email us at info@nnco.nano.gov. And of course, check back here for more stories.